Good morning, everybody. This is Wednesday morning. I'm actually in the car at the veterinarian. Frank has a phobia of veterinarians, so we sedated him to get him here. We have trouble getting him from the car to the veterinarian, so we just had the gurney out. He's just going in for some x-rays. We're concerned. And anyway, I think this is working. I'll be fairly short today. Since we're doing it from the car, and since Linda and Coco are talking here, we'll see how that works. What I wanted to do in a more positive sense is tell you how exhilarating I was on Saturday. Saturday was a very special day. Saturday was a space launch, the first one in over 10 years for the United States. And boy, I remember as a boy growing up, the rocket launches of the old Gemini program, the suspense, the build up, the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 countdown, and boy, was the rocket sleek. And Doug and Bob are the new astronauts. They've been partners and astronauts for a long time, and they appear to be great mates. The weather was good on Saturday. They're talking about sending another rocket up in about 30 days to go to Mars with a lunar rover. That's pretty cool. Not a lunar rover, a Mars rover. But it was exhilarating. It brought back memories, and it was a positive in the midst of lots of other news that goes around us today. So I wanted to think about the heavenlies and how God has made the heavenlies, and how beautiful the rocket ship was when it went up. The first stage, they actually came back and landed on spot so they can reuse the first stage. I was impressed with astronaut Christina Koch, who had spent 328 days in this space station. 328 days. That's a lot of self-quarantine. She was by herself. They tell me the space station is bigger than I thought it was. They said it's the size of 10 school buses in different directions. And I didn't realize it was that big. But as we think about space and we think about the heavenlies, how can we not think about the wonder and the creation of God? Right from the very beginning, the heavenlies have been talked about as the source of God's home, source of God's place. Biblically, it refers to those things. It refers, of course, to the place where rain comes from, the sky, the atmosphere, but more often in the Bible, the heavenlies talk about those realms that are beyond this world, beyond the senses, and into the heavenly realms, the realms of God. I don't have a lot of text with me right here in the car. I was going to be home by this time, and apparently I didn't make it home. They've kept us here and wait for Frank to get done. So I don't have my Bible with me. I don't have the verses with me. But I'd like you to think about the heavenlies and all the good things that the heavenlies might mean. It's beyond imagination. And I just wanted you to, in the midst of all the negatives right now and all the pandemics and all the perfect storm things, from economics to riots to I just wanted you to think about the heavenlies. Close your eyes and think about the wonders of God from universe to universe to universe. He's beyond all the universes, and science tells us that the universes are abounding in all of space. And God cares about us. Of all the universes and all the planets, God is aware of planet Earth. God put free will creatures called human beings on planet Earth. God cared so much about planet Earth that he came to Earth incarnate, Jesus, to show us and help us to understand God. For Jesus gives us the role models that we need. Remember the campaign WWJD, what would Jesus do? And everyone was wearing bracelets and thinking about a nobler way of living. I read something on Facebook yesterday about WWJD. WWJD is on my mind. One of my friends wrote this. A few years ago, when I was still gainfully employed with some students at a university, I asked people what the WWJD meant. And they said, well, it means, what would Jesus do? This professor writes, people were wearing the slogan as a personal reminder to be thoughtful and intentional and to make decisions in their personal and professional lives based on the teachings and the examples of Jesus. That's not a bad model today, is it? To think about making decisions based on the modeling and the teachings of Jesus. It also gives a subtle reminder to others of the wearer's beliefs and aims in life. And it is a message to others that we ought to be better, we ought to be happier, we ought to be able to cross the racial boundaries and the tensions in a different sort of way. I've seen some wonderful testimonies on the news broadcast. I saw a 16-year-old boy in Detroit who was leading some of the peaceful riots from that side. The mayor actually called him and said, you know, you've been so respectful, you've been so proper, you've been so dynamic and charismatic. And the mayor complimented him on the way that this 16-year-old was speaking and also keeping people in a way of a peaceful protest about a very real concern. Well, my friend goes on and writes, in this time of unprecedented social, political, economic, religious, and racial division, I'm wondering if it might be a good time to use the WWJD movement as a guide to engaging our friends, our neighbors, our families, our governments, and the world at large. What do you think about that? WWJD. You know, that all began back in the 1800s with a guy named Charles Sheldon. Charles Sheldon wrote a book, In His Steps. I have one of the older copies of that book, but I'd almost make it required reading. It's pretty thick, pretty intense, easy read, but it takes a community that was challenged to live the way Jesus lived. And it documents in fictional the changes and the positives that happens to a community when one by one people begin to look and wonder, how is Jesus living? Living like Jesus lives. It's not a bad model for us today. One last thing I'd like to share, and again, I'm in the car I have my Bible with me. I should have had it. It's on my phone, but I can't do that and do this at the same time. But tomorrow we'll get back to talking about the miracles of Jesus. Thursday and Friday we'll look at some miracles. I'm preparing a sermon on Sunday for the miracles of Jesus, what we can learn. But I don't think I've ever shared with you some of the ideas about how miracles work. I know we talked earlier about miracles seem to be a source that comes out of desperation. When we're desperate, God seems to show up. We saw that last week in Jesus calming the storm, and we saw it in Jesus walking on the water. Kerry Shook, who's the founding pastor of the Woodlands Church down in Texas, has several things to say about miracles that I think is useful to us, and we'll refer back to these Thursday and Friday. But miracles are very special. Number one, God always starts with the miracle you need most. Number two, the miracle you need leads us to what we really need. And what we really need is a deeper relationship with God. So whenever we're the beneficiary of a miracle, of God's intervening to us, it is a time where we are drawn into God's presence. Didn't we see the disciples last week with the calming of the sea and Jesus walking on the water? The disciples' faith grew, and their understanding and relationship with Jesus grew. Number three, God works a miracle in His time and in His way. We can never quite determine, and He always surprises us, how He does and how He answers the prayers of our deepest heart. Number four, miracles in your life are not always for our benefit, but will always bring Him glory and will always point people to Jesus. When we look at life and we look at people's behaviors, I often ask myself, is this drawing people closer to Jesus? Is this drawing people closer? And I want to draw you closer to faith in Jesus. We differ on many things. We're human beings. But the one thing that unites us is the Apostles' Creed. God the Creator, Jesus the Son, God incarnate, the representation, the perfect representation of God in the context of earthly living. And then also, the Holy Spirit indwells in the life of the believers, giving a natural dimension that needs to be fostered and grown, as well as our physical dimension. So we live in two dimensions and two worlds. We've talked about that. We live in the spirit and we live in the flesh. And both come together and we work in both. We live in both. And what helps set the stage for the future? What helps set the stage for a miracle? We'll talk more about this, but Kerry Shook talks about being humble. Humility helps set the stage for being a recipient of one of God's inner miracles. Of God. Important. In the old days, they called it the respect of God. the honoring the values of God. And finally, believing is seeing. Most people who receive the miracles of Jesus believe, and then they are astounded by the answer and the response